Hey, it's Joe. I'm glad you're here, and if you could do me a little favor and please subscribe, if you haven't already. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers. I would greatly appreciate it. If you're returning, you'll notice a new intro and new background sound. Hope you'll like it. Alright, let's get on with the stories. Back in January 1995, while driving home on leave, I experienced something straight out of a movie. I was getting ready to be deployed to Gitmo for a joint task force mission and needed my parents to take care of my 2 kittens I had adopted a few months earlier. The drive home usually takes around 6 to 7 hours, but I didn't mind the drive. Anyone who's ever driven through Texas knows that you can drive for quite a while and not see another car on the road. It's 9 p.m., and I'm 15 minutes outside of Seymour, Texas, heading towards Dallas. The 2 cats that, for the most part, had taken residence on my back section by the rear window had been sleeping. It was here that things started to get strange. I noticed about 200 plus meters behind me another vehicle's headlights and thought nothing of it. A few moments later, the cats both started making this moaning noise over and over again. I figured they needed to go to the restroom, so I pulled over in the middle of nowhere with these 2 cats freezing because it's January and I'm waiting for them to do their business. After about 5 minutes and a cigarette, I opt to put them back in the car and give them a little dry food. I began heading back down the road. 10 minutes go by, and I see headlights again behind me, possibly a little closer than before. Both cats jump up to the rear window and begin making their noises again. It's here where I realize that the car behind me earlier never passed me. But why? It was a while ago when I stopped. I started to slow down in order to let the vehicle overtake. But after going over a hill, the headlights vanished and no car ever drove by. I went through another small town and stopped to stretch my legs. It would have been around 10 p.m. now, and I wouldn't have much longer to go. I started back on the 2-lane interstate and was moving along around 65 to 70 miles an hour, and sure enough, about 10 minutes out of town, the lights returned. This time I said screw it and stepped on the gas. As I approached the bridge heading into the next town, I blew past a police car. He, of course, turned around and lit me up. I pulled over, unrolled down my window, showed him my driver's license, military ID, and badge. He asked me what the hurry was, but seemed distracted while he stood next to my car. He kept looking up at the sky. I told him that for the past hour, I was being followed, and no matter what I did, the vehicle behind me just kept pace. He let me off with a warning and told me to take a right at the flashing stoplight and cut through town. He said he would stop the next car to come through and check them out, and also mentioned they were receiving multiple claims from nearby residents of weird lights in the sky and noises. I thanked him and did as he suggested, and didn't have another issue for the remainder of my trip home. If anyone has ever experienced anything similar, I would love to hear about it. One night, I was solo camping in a remote lake above a small town. You're not allowed to come near the lake, so I hiked up a little ways onto the hillside and set up underneath the camouflage tarp. It must have been around midnight. I was all snuggled in my hammock when I heard laughing and yelling in the distance. I peeked out from behind my tarp to see what looked like a handful of college-age dudes drinking, fishing, and having a good time. Okay, whatever. I tried to sleep anyway. I drifted in and out for about an hour, but I was kept from sleeping by an extremely loud bird in the tree next to me that just kept hooting and screeching. Eventually, I picked up a large branch and swung it at the tree to shut it up. Suddenly, the Dude brothers went silent. I could tell that they froze, and they were looking intently in my direction, trying to find the source of the noise. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but the bird started again. I decided I needed to find some pine cones or something to throw at it to scare it away. So, I got out of my sleeping bag, moved outside the tarp, and started looking on the ground. I decided to try the branch again and slammed it as hard as I could to the tree trunk, and the sound rang out loudly. They all looked over to see a pale, naked figure hunched over in the tree line staring at them, I immediately scrambled on all fours under my tarp. Then it must have looked like some horrible pale creature disappeared into the underbrush after having been caught observing them. They went silent, had a muffled, terrified conversation, and packed up and left. I slept soundly for the rest of the night, but those guys must have been pretty freaked out. I am an avid urban explorer, and in December, a friend and I drove to a location about 45 minutes away from home. It was in a small town in Pennsylvania. To get to the abandoned and more or less crumbling house, we had to drive on a one-lane road through a forest. When we entered that road, there was a dead deer lying on the side of the road, not uncommon, but it would be later on. Then her GPS malfunctioned and told us to return to the route, even though we were already on it. The arrow was pointing in the opposite direction. We were going away from the forest. We kept driving anyway and turned into the parking lot. There were only a few cars there. There's a walking trail in the forest that people used to bike and run. We go to the structure, an old water tower, and take some pictures and decide to walk on the trail. We're both feeling really off, like there was a secret that everyone on the path knew except for us. We were the only ones on the path, and we were walking and making small talk when we heard a bike bell behind us. We turned around, and a woman goes ahead of us on her bike and then stops to tie her shoe. We keep walking, and my friend says, "Look at her bike. There's no bell on it, so we have no idea where the bell came from." There were only about 4 cars in the parking lot, but we ended up passing over 30 people. They all stared at us too, never breaking eye contact. My friend pointed out something, a boulder that had a stream of water trickling down it, but there wasn't a source or a crack. It was just starting from the middle of the rock. Again, it was weird. We kept walking down the trail, and I stopped and pointed into the forest. There was a tall black figure standing far by the trees. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any clothes or even a face. We were looking at it when there was a loud snapping noise right behind us, like a tree branch. We turned around quickly, but there weren't any sticks or branches on the ground at all. When we looked back in the direction of the figure, it was gone. All in about 5 seconds, the entire time we felt drowsy. So we decided that we were going to walk back to the car and leave. There was no one else there and no cars in the parking lot. We drove back through the forest road. We were only out there for about an hour, and when we got to the intersection that brought us out to the forest, the deer was still on the side of the road, except it was entirely bones, just a skeleton, not even bloody. It was completely clean. All that was left was the head, which was still on the skeleton. Nothing could have eaten or skinned it that fast, especially not without leaving any fur or blood. At this point, we were freaked out enough and just wanted to go home. And then her trunk opened. There's a certain button on the car that you have to press, and her hands weren't even near it. She got out of the car to close it, and all of the doors in the car clicked and locked on their own, except my passenger door that stayed unlocked. We had service too, but her GPS wouldn't start to work again until we were out of that town. I don't really know what happened, but it felt like something in that place wanted us gone, and every time we pointed out something that was strange, something else would distract us from looking too closely at it. I'd love some closure to this. It still makes me feel uneasy. Sometimes I dream about it, and the same word always comes into the dream. Harvest. I don't know why. A couple of minutes ago, I looked up the coordinates to the place because I had them on my phone but couldn't remember the address. The people wanted to know where this place was, and the first thing to pop up was abandoned paper mills to be demolished on Friday. There was no talk of demolishing the place a month ago. Me, my wife, and our 2 children were on a trip from point A to point B. We planned to stop the first evening into our trip with a friend of ours who happened to be near our route. Since we would be arriving at about 1 a.m., our friend left the door unlocked so that we could let ourselves in. Now, this wasn't a large city by any means, but out in the sticks near DeKalb, Texas. So we slipped in as quietly as we could, went back to the room that had been set up for us, and proceeded to try and get some sleep. The room was roughly 10 by 10, mobile home rooms. Gotta love them. My daughter, the 4-year-old, was on a pallet of blankets on one side of the room, and my son started off there but got fussy, so my wife picked him up and let him sleep with us on the bed. The bed was pushed up in the corner all the way, and I was sleeping up against the wall. My wife had the outside, and our son was somewhere in the mix. We closed the door and turned off the light. It's pitch dark. Roughly an hour later, I hear my wife scream that someone's in the room. I open my eyes and see a black figure move towards the door. I wear contacts, so I couldn't distinguish what I saw, only that it appeared to have been a human shape. I leapt from the bed and bear hugged the intruder. The problem was I couldn't get a hold of it. I could feel its body up against mine, but every time I went to bear hug it, my arms went through it. I could see the blackness. I felt the shape up against my body, but couldn't grab it. I was pushed away from whatever it was. I heard my wife scream something about the light. I went for where I thought the light switch was and felt something clawing and scratching on my upper body. I found the light switch on the wall and saw nothing. Absolutely nothing, well, other than the damage from what looked like a tornado had hit our room. My wife was still in bed, scared witless. My daughter was on one of the open corners of the room, cowering under a blanket, and my infant son was on the floor next to the bed. Being the manly man that I am, I did the most sane thing I've ever done, and that was to open the door to the room. A bathroom was right next to our room, you see. Flicked on the light, and no one was in there. I turned on the next light I could find, and no one was there. I checked the front door. It was deadlocked and deadbolted from the inside. You can't leave a house and deadbolt a door from the inside. There were no other sounds, noises, or movement. I ran back to our room and called a friend. Yes, I should have checked physically, but at this point, my adrenaline was wearing off, and panic was starting to settle in. Our friend answered and said she was okay, and then she walked down to our room while we took in what happened. My wife has calmed the baby and our daughter down. They're all fine. My wife has blood pouring from her mouth and can barely speak. She has deep scratch marks from her neck to her ears down to her breasts. I have a fat, bloody lip, deep scratch marks on my chest, neck, and back, even though I'd slept in a shirt that night. I also have what looks like carpet burn on the top of my right foot. The sewing machine table that was in the room had been thrown across near where my daughter was laying. After we calmed down and collected our wits, we started probing what we just went through. I recounted everything you've heard, and my wife said that she heard the door open and a big black cat jump on her chest and begin crawling at her. Its face was smushed up against hers, causing her to feel strangled. The cat then started using its paws to strangle her. She gasped out that someone was in the room, which is when I awoke to see a black figure moving across it. All this was going on. Our friend had absolutely nothing. No shouts, no bumping around, nothing. Our friend and most others that we've told the story to think that my wife and I were fighting each other in our sleep, which I'm not past believing. She sleeps with her eyes open at times and used to sleepwalk when she was younger. But we don't think this is the case. We've told a few other friends about it, and they've stated they've had similar experiences. Big black cats strangling someone in bed, and another person wakes up to see something, but that something gets away. The next thing that makes me think this wasn't a dream gone bad were my wounds. My wife's healed up fine. It took 2 months for the scratches on my chest, neck, and back to completely go away. The carpet burn, however, took 4 months to heal. We tried medicating ointments and nothing worked. We went to our doctor, but at that point, it had begun clearing up on its own, and he didn't want to do anything. He made a comment saying that the spot looked like it had been burned. If you've ever seen a third-degree burn, they look similar. Now I can believe that my wife can make the scratches, but not what was on my foot. You can make out a slightly visible scar through my hobbit-like foot hair. I am of the persuasion that these events were something spiritual. A few years ago, I was working a night shift on a generic rehabilitation ward in an old hospital that has since closed down. The ward was a long L-shaped corridor, with the nurses' station situated at the bend. I was doing some paperwork at the nurses' station, and the other nurse on duty was on her break, sitting in the lounge at the end of the corridor. Out of nowhere, I heard this almighty crash from one of the bedrooms, and I shot straight up and started running towards it. My colleague was coming down the corridor towards me, as we had both assumed that the gentleman in one of the single beds had fallen out of the bed. However, the man in this room was still fast asleep in bed, and his sensor mat told us that he had not gotten up. In the middle of the room lay his bedside cabinet, face down on the ground. Further across from that, the drawer from it was against the floor on the wall across from where the cabinet usually faced. We didn't really know what to make of it, so I picked up the cabinet and put the drawer back in. We woke the man up and asked him if he had thrown it, but he was as confused as we were. Realistically, he couldn't have moved it anyway. It was quite heavy, and he was pretty frail, needing help to even mobilize. It wasn't possible that another patient had been in the room, as we did a round immediately after, and everyone was in bed. No one had been in the corridor prior to this happening. For the next few weeks, I felt really uncomfortable being in that room, even during the day duties, and was so glad when the hospital closed down, as it meant I got to move to a brand newly built one. My grandma's house is chocked full of weird stories, going way back. Pretty much everything weird and scary has happened in the hallway leading to the spare bedroom. My grandma would see my grandpa's silhouette walking down the hall. He'd stop at the door to their bedroom and peer in, and she'd ask if he needed something. He wouldn't answer and would keep walking. Peeved, she would get up to ask him again, only to find him in the living room sleeping or watching TV, insisting he'd been there the whole time. My mom has heard someone calling her name from the same hall, and once we were there alone, house-sitting while my grandparents were out of town. They were due back late that night, and my mom and I both heard heavy footsteps coming from the hall. She told me they must have come home early, and as she went to greet them, she realized there was no one there. The guest room at the end of the same hall has a TV that would turn on by itself. They also had a couple stay there, and neither one was particularly superstitious. The next morning, the husband was unusually quiet. He finally got a chance to talk to my grandma alone and said very simply, "Someone was watching us last night." He had seen a figure standing in the corner of the room, staring at them. He had been so frightened that he just closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. When my grandma pressed for details, he kind of shrugged it off and didn't want to talk about it anymore. There's also a middle bedroom between the spare room and my grandparents' room, which we have always just called Tipsy Danger's room, because I used to stay with them so often. I was on my bed once when I heard a thump and then a skittering noise, like something had jumped off the bed and was running across the floor. I thought it was the cat being weird, so I sat up to see what she was doing, only to find that the cat was at the foot of the bed, staring intently at the doorway to the hall. I looked around for a bit and was unable to find anything. A few years back, we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of British Columbia. All the crews had gone home, and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We headed out of the motel, an hour or so into the bush, middle of nowhere, along deactivated logging roads. The closest town was miles and miles away, and we hiked out to one area that we had found a few weeks previously. For some reason, the whole area just felt off. So we got down to business, and about 15 minutes after being launched over mapping, there was this weird, deafening whomp sound. It was like I could feel pressure in my ears. I immediately looked at my boss about 20 feet away, and he was white as a ghost, staring back at me, standing. And then it happened again. My ear and chest pressure went crazy, and it felt like I was being squeezed. Chills all over my body, and every hair was standing on end. My boss just looked at me and said, "Let's go." We grabbed all of our stuff and speed hiked back to the truck. We never discussed it, no clue what it was, but I've never been so freaked out in my life. Thinking about it 10 years later, it still gives me chills. I have a couple of stories about camping. One year, I was working for the forestry for the summer, so I decided to camp out near where the work was. I would go into town only once or twice a month for supplies. On the forestry road on the way there was a fellow camper a few miles from my campsite. He wasn't working with me, so I figured maybe he was a hunter or something. After a couple of times of passing his campsite and seeing that his car was never moved, I decided that if the car was still there by the next time I drove by, I'd stop to see if he was okay. Thankfully, as it turned out, one of my fellow co-workers had the same thought, and he got there first. He could tell by the smell when he approached the guy's trailer that something was seriously wrong. When he went inside, he found the guy with maggots crawling out of where his eyes had been. It was a hot summer, and his body had been there for quite a while before my buddy found him. My buddy guessed it was a heart attack or something, and he reported it to the police, and they dealt with it, but we never heard any more about it. I was 7 years old at the time this happened. One day out of the blue, I woke up having this odd feeling like something bad would happen. I couldn't put my finger on what exactly it was, so I shrugged it off. At the time this happened, I was staying at my beloved grandmother's house. I would get to her house straight from school, do my homework, and when done, watch soap operas with her. She was sweet and caring, so she would always check on me at night because she knew that I had trouble sleeping. She would sit on my bed and rub my legs. After a couple of days upon arriving from school while having lunch at her house, I received terrible news. My beloved grandma had fallen ill. My aunt informed me that she would be staying at the hospital for some time in order to get better from hepatitis B and meningitis. I would visit her every day for over a month right after school until one day I wasn't allowed to see her anymore. She had health complications, and doctors feared she wouldn't make it through the night, and they were right. She passed away in her sleep that same night. When that happened, I got an overwhelming sadness, even when no one had even told me yet that she was gone. There is when that odd feeling I had started to make sense. The funeral came around, and I wasn't allowed to go since it was no place for a child. My parents tried to shelter me from the event, hiding what death meant. They said Nana went on a trip, but I knew the truth. That hurt me in a way, because I didn't get to say goodbye. The day she was buried, I remember all the family arrived at her house to spend some time together. We shared stories, looked at pictures, until time came around and we said our goodbyes and went to bed. So I followed my usual routine and went to sleep. Later, during the middle of the night, my door creaked open. I thought nothing of it until I saw a dent formed on my bed like someone was sitting down, and I felt a stroke on my legs. I sat up, too tired to process what was going on, and said with a groggy voice, "Good night, Nana." I waved my hand at her and began falling asleep. After that happened, I felt the mattress rise as if she had stood up from the bed and closed the door softly. She left behind this peace and calmness. I like to believe that she came to say goodbye. Later that same year, a couple of months after my Nana passed, my mom got pregnant with twins. Everything was great. That was the news and joy that we needed. Everything was wonderful. But one day, same as before my Nana fell ill, I had this dread come over me, this feeling that something was wrong. I told my mom that I felt something was wrong, and she told me to brush it off, as it was most likely nothing. A few days after this, I sort of forgot about the feeling, carried my day on as usual, and went home after school. I was alone in the house doing my homework at the dinner table, when out of nowhere, I heard the sounds of babies crying from the room my parents were setting up for the twins. I could distinguish two different cries. This feeling of dread and sadness washed over me again. I decided that since I was about to be a big sister, I had to see what was going on in my baby sibling's room. Somehow I managed to gather up the courage, stand up, and walk towards the door. As I approached the room, the crying started to fade away when it was really intense before. The moment I placed my hand on the doorknob, the crying stopped. I opened up the door, and the room is empty. That night, my dad came home and told me that my mom was in the hospital and that she would have to stay there for some time. Also, that's when she came. The babies were not going to be in her tummy anymore. He made sure I understood they were not coming because they had passed away. I looked at my dad, muttered okay, and went to my room. I laid in bed and cried non-stop until I fell asleep. Yet, I woke up in the early dawn to the feeling of a hand on my leg, but I wasn't scared. So I looked over and saw a dent on my bed, the same way it happened a few months ago. I had this undeniable feeling that was my Nana. I knew I could ask this from her, so I said, "Look out for them, Nana, please." I waved my hand and fell asleep again. In the morning, I awoke knowing that everything would be all right. Since that time 14 years ago, I have not felt Nana's presence again, but I still get that dreadful feeling every time something bad will happen. You might think I'm bluffing, but it's true, and I don't like getting that feeling. It causes me to become quite anxious and reserved. Sadly, that odd feeling never fails. One time I knew a friend of mine would lose his mom, and I couldn't stop it. Anyway, I'm positive my Nana is still looking out for me. So, Nana, wherever you are, thank you, and I hope we do meet again.